In April last year, the new Isle of Man government announced it was seeking to make ongoing cost reductions totalling £25 million over 5 years. They sought the views of the public on how government could save money and sustain services, and 1,300 contributions were received on how this could be done. The whole scheme was given the title Securing Added Value and Efficiencies Programme, and that mouthful became known by the acronym SAVE. After a process of internal evaluation and appraisal of ideas, some contained in the 2018 budget, external consultants, PwC, researched and evaluated a number of the shortlisted projects, and the Treasury says this was to enable decisions to be informed by independent, objective and evidence-based analysis. Well, this work is contained in the latest progress report. Treasury Minister Alfred Cannan will present an update at the June sitting of Tynwald, when he will move that Tynwald receives the report. It's a weighty tome with hundreds of pages, mainly in the appendices. It's quite long-winded in places, and it contains many recommendations, but the three that immediately stand out are changes in education, changes in transport, and the way legal assistance for defence in criminal cases is provided. Thought, according to the report, to save £1 million each. Already the union Unite has reacted, describing the report as a Trojan horse, and claims that it's a preemptive strike by the Treasury Minister against the Chief Minister and Comyn. Well, Eric Holmes says that the feasibility of an all-Ireland mass strike as the worst-case scenario is measured against a 1% possible gain. Well, those are fighting and threatening words. The revolutionary idea to set up a government-run public defenders unit to replace the current system of providing independent assistance by advocates for defendants eligible for legal aid has not gone down all that well with the Isle of Man Law Society, we believe, which represents 239 advocates. In today's programme, our studio guest will be Jane Gray. She's the president of the Isle of Man Law Society, and she is with us today to discuss the implications, as they see them, of the public defender scheme. And shortly, later on the programme, we shall hear from the Treasury Minister. But first, Jane, well, thank you for joining us today, Jane.
Well, thank you, Roger, for inviting me.
A pleasure. Just for your first time on one of these programmes.
It is so, yes.
Oh, well, never mind. We'll be gentle. That's it. President of the Law Society. When were you appointed, or how were you appointed as well?
I was appointed through the Law Society's AGM by the members back in 2017, following a 2-year period of office as Vice President. I've spent a number of years as a council member, being around 8 years.
Right.
And when I was asked to be the Vice President, I was initially had my reservations because the position on council, all council members, is a voluntary position. It is unpaid, and it does require an awful lot of work. But I very much enjoyed the experience as a vice president, and when it naturally came up to the president's position, and it's not necessarily automatic. It still has to be voted in by the members. I definitely stepped up to the plate and took the challenge, and have enjoyed my role there very much.
And is it a finite term of office? Is it up for election every year, every 2 years?
Yes, it is up for election after each year, but there is a maximum term of which the President and Vice President can serve, and that is a maximum term of 2 years.
Okay, right. So, we're talking about the Law Society. I suppose, bearing in mind our listeners, many will obviously know what it is, but I suspect a lot will not. So, in a short way, could you tell us what the Law Society is?
Well, the Law Society has a twofold approach, that it's both regulatory and promotory. The Law Society works both with the courts, the government, to ensure that the work that we do is fully supported and appropriately regulated, naturally as a profession, both for the benefit of the public and the profession, and also the jurisdiction of the Isle of Man.
So it's a sort of, I was almost going to describe it as a trade union, but it's not quite like
not
that.
Really, no. But I mean, the Law Society is the oldest profession on the island, it being established in 1859.
Mm-hmm. Right, well, fine. Now, let's just go to one more point before we go to our next piece, and that is, I gather, apart from being the second woman to hold this office since 1859, which is interesting. Is this a sign of the times, do you think?
I do, yes, it is certainly a sign of the times. You're looking at other neighbouring jurisdictions and the percentage of women now coming through into law, and they have now just about passed the halfway mark. And that figure is continuing to increase. And though I am the only second female president following Sharon Roberts' term in 2008, I do also have the support of my Vice President, Irene Newby. Now this is the first time ever in the history of the Law Society that we've had both females undertaking the Vice President and President's role.
Right, well, very good. Now, let's just go to one more small thing and then we'll go on to the meat of the programme. Deemster Crucian Endeavour Award, which you won. Tell us about it.
Yes, I did. I was only notified of that only this week, and initially, obviously, I was very surprised. But it is an award that was created back in 2010 in memory of the much respected and loved First Deemster, Michael Carrouche. He had a number of principles, but one of them being, in his words, was never give up and always do your best. And this is the key criteria for assessment of advocates who've shown the most endeavour within the preceding year. And it was a small way to mark the passing of what we do hold as a very significant man.
Now you're talking about endeavour. I presume you're talking about endeavour within the legal framework.
Yes, it's working to endeavour, whether professionally or within the community. So it goes beyond your day job, should I say, of working within the community. I sit on the board of a number of voluntary organisations, one of them being Motivate, Alcohol Advisory Service. I'm their honorary advocate. I also sit on the board of the Manx Citizens Advice Bureau in Ramsey. And around 18 months ago, I decided to sign myself up as a volunteer for the Civil Defence Corps. I felt at that time it was important to actually do something outside of the legal profession. And I've enjoyed my time there very much.
Well, congratulations. Now, we'll now have to get down to the meat of our subject, of course, which this is the Public Defender's proposal, plan, whatever way you want to put it, that's in this particular report. Now, it's generally thought that the whole report was a product of the Treasury. And earlier this week, Catherine Nicoll spoke to the Treasury Minister about how he considered the whole thing was going, because this is a progress report, and this is what he had to say.
Well, I would say we're at a midway stage, which is nicely reflecting exactly where we are in our overall targets. We set out to find £15 million of savings, additional savings from the government programme, from departments, from public services. We think we've identified £6 to £7 million of that £15 million. That's reflected in this SAVE report. That will go before Tynwald in June for comment and for noting and for approval effectively. And we've got to press on and push forward and identify another £6 to £7 million in the next 3 years.
Now, in the budget this year, you revised the target savings for SAVE from 25 to 15. Is 15 a realistic target now? Do you think that's achievable?
I do think it's achievable, but as with all these types of projects, they tend to start off and the easy part's getting the ideas together, then getting through to evaluation and implementation is always a lot harder. But we have to find this money. We've set ourselves very clear targets in terms of our budget performance over the 5 years, the need to find this additional money to cope with the effects and impact of the public sector pensions deficit that will impact onto the revenue account, effectively the government's day-to-day spending in 2021, 2022. So we have to do it, and we are going to work hard to achieve that. Obviously, this is one part of an overall programme, including straightforward budgetary controls and cost controls that we've implemented. We've also got other programmes going, such as the digital strategy, and alongside that, a clear focus on our economic growth programme. And bringing all those together will ultimately take us to a position where, if we're successful, we'll have come out in 2021, 2022 with a balanced budget and a budget that is actually returning money back to our reserves, but most importantly is coping with the £50 million that we need when the Public Sector Pensions Reserve Fund runs out.
Now, this is based on a public response. You asked the public to get in touch. I think there were something like 1,300 responses to the call for ideas. That's been whittled down now. Do you think there are a lot of people that are going to be disappointed that their ideas aren't being progressed, that haven't been taken seriously, if you like, by government?
Well, there's huge range and diversity of ideas, but what we've done is a lot of the smaller ideas have been filtered straight out to departments to deal with. They weren't deemed worthy or big enough to be dealt with as part of a sort of central project. We've consolidated a lot of those ideas, put them together in various groupings, and really we've ended up with the 8 or so active projects that we've got at the moment. It tended to bring us about £6 to £7 million worth of savings. There are other projects being lined up. We're still doing the proof of concept of those projects. We'll be hopefully bringing those forward in the next 12 months. And I think that people will go online, they'll be able to go online and can go online and see where their ideas are up to or got to in terms of the process. And clearly out of the 1,300 or so ideas, there were some really strong ones, some that were reflective throughout in terms of reflecting other people's ideas, and some which weren't really feasible. But everybody who contributed, the ideas are, the realistic and proper ideas are there online for them to see, and they can see which stage of the process they're at. But the key point here is that, you know, what we've done is we've really taken forward not only public's ideas, but ideas from within government as well, consolidated it, knocked it into shape, if you like, presenting the first set of consolidated ideas that are being taken forward. We'll come forward with more, and we just will continue to push to hit this £15 million target that we've set ourselves.
When you talk about efficiencies in government, there have been drives to create more efficiencies in government for, 8 years now. How effective has that been? I mean, if there is still scope to claw back £15 million, you think, over a 3-year period, how much efficiency savings have actually been achieved to date?
Well, I think, to be fair, I mean, there have been some, but it's just been the mechanism by which they've been driven. I mean, in the past, it's just been driven by straightforward budgetary controls. In other words, Treasury effectively top slicing out of budget and bringing in other fundraising mechanisms. What we've done here is something different. We've tried to bring it all under one roof, trying to focus people's minds, get a clear picture of how we're delivering better efficiencies and more value for public money across government as a whole. And as a result, I think that we will end this term by having clearly documented how we've set about improving efficiencies across government, how we've set about reforming public services to get better value. So this is a fairly unique project as far as I can see in terms of government. We've had lots of reports before, Scope of Government Report 1, Scope of Government Report 2, for example. But I think this is the first time, and certainly a long time, that we've seen a consolidated attempt to deliver across government a range of initiatives that are going to deliver both savings, but also importantly that we don't just get savings, but we get better efficiencies and ultimately better value for the public, and hopefully a better service for the public in some of these areas as well.
When any programmes are rolled out, when any initiatives are brought in, there are usually costs involved. I mean, what is the cost of implementing this programme?
There has been cost attached to it. I think our last estimate was about £350,000 has been spent so far in terms of getting the reports together for this programme, assessing some of the projects schemes, and some of those schemes have not gone forward. Those schemes that have predominantly been put forward are accompanied by some sort of report that's invariably an expert or consultancy type report. So £350,000 has been expended. But when you look at the overall size of the savings and ongoing savings at £6 to £7 million per annum, I think so far it's been conducted in a cost-effective manner, that the costs associated with this are relative, are right, and also reflective of the need to do it. But also, when you compare, as I say, the overall savings that we're achieving, I think that they've been relatively minimal.
What are the main issues you're working on? We've got this report so far. There's a progress report on the SAVE programme. What areas are you now focusing on for savings?
There's a number of areas that are still waiting proof of concept reports, and we will make those public in due course. The reason why we're not necessarily going to make those public at the moment is naturally because there's a lot of sensitivities around some of those areas, and it's not right necessarily to bring those straight out to the public attention until we're absolutely clear on which direction of travel that we are going to adopt. As you will see in this report, there are some quite controversial areas that haven't been taken forward, and we need an opportunity to make sure we've got the right information and the right direction of travel before we publicise that. So that's all got to come forward. And alongside that, we will have to make assessments as we go through this process as to whether we are or are not going to make our target. Now, I'm confident that we're going to make our target in terms of the additional savings that we need, but we do need to keep an eye on that. And alongside that, obviously, there's a number of other projects that we're running to counterbalance this, including digital investment in digitalisation, and also control on terms of budgetary controls. And most importantly, of course, is the economic growth. Now, we've had very good economic growth in terms of income into Treasury over the last 18 months or so. We've got to keep going with that, but we can't be complacent and sit back and expect that better than expected economic growth is going to resolve our issues. It's really important that we keep pushing forward, and I think the SAVE programme and the SAVE campaign is proving to be a very important platform for government to be able to continue to seek these sorts of efficiencies, these sorts of improvements, and not to slip into some form of complacency, which will not serve us well in 3 or 4 years' time.
We have seen in the past when government talks about efficiency savings or an efficiency drive, the situation you end up with is increased charges or cuts to services. Now, neither of those are actually efficiency savings. Are these genuine efficiency savings? Is this doing the same thing better for less?
Well, when I look across at all the programmes we've got, the Public Defender Unit, the consolidation of higher education, bringing together the transport system, the review of casual and agency staff, the implementation of technology and process systems into other areas of government, then I think the ultimate outcome will be better service delivery, better value for money. And the last thing that we want to do is to go around cutting, because cuts aren't always productive. I think this government's been about finding better value. I think the government has been about finding better ways to deliver the service. And that's what we've been focused on. And I think that's what's encompassed within the SAVE report. And of course, I do say in my forward, whilst you might think of the word SAVE as reducing or cutting, actually what the acronym is securing added value and efficiencies. And that's what this is about. It's not about...
The Treasury Minister, Alfred Cannan, was talking to Catherine Nicoll. With me in the studio is Jane Gray, who's the president of the Isle of Man Law Society. What did you make of that, Jane? Because he went on to talk about the Public Defender's new scheme, which we're going to talk about. What was your reaction? What was the Law Society's reaction to that?
The Law Society's reaction in respect to what Mr Cannan has just stated, that the SAVE programme and scheme is looking to reform public services and provide a greater value for the people of the island, that it would be efficient and would be a much better service. The Law Society's view is that this scheme is likely to increase costs to government. There's going to be civil liberty concerns in respect to whether the advocates within the Public Defence Service are going to be deemed as being purely independent, given this is a policy that's also being driven by the Attorney General, who happens to be the head of the prosecution services and prosecutes in the name of the Crown. But the Law Society is concerned in respect to what research analysis has the Treasury actually undertaken to determine that there are going to be savings implemented by this scheme.
Isn't that what they commissioned PwC to do?
They certainly did, and from what we were told, this report consists of a mere 2 pages and something that we have requested to see, and that request has been denied. Since the Law Society was informed back in October 2017 by the Attorney General that this was certainly something that they were looking to bring in and make legislative changes, we have been trying to obtain that information as to see whether it really is going to be a viable option and it is going to be more efficient and better value for the public. A number of freedom of information requests were made. A couple of those were denied on the basis that the actual decision hadn't been made at that time. But however, one of the freedom of information requests did produce a number of the figures that included the legal aid expenditure for the period of over the last 10 years. And we note that the 2.3 million that has been put forward as a yearly legal aid expenditure in the report was actually the highest year out of those 10 preceding years. And it is noted that during that period of time there were some very high profile cases that was the reasons for that increase. What we have noted looking at the figures that in the last 5 years the actual average cost of the legal aid expenditure was 1.7 million and not 2.3 as stated in the report, and that over the past 5 years the legal aid expenditure has actually decreased by 804,000, contrary to the remarks made in Tynwald that legal aid was starting to spiral out of control.
So that means if we just take your figures, just a little bit of rough arithmetic at the moment, if we take those figures, that means that instead of saving $1 million, you've managed to slice it down to somewhere in the region of about 700,000.
Well, looking at the report figures, they've stated that in order to set up the public defence unit, they're going to be looking at salaries of around
70,000, I should say, not 700,000.
Yes, around 650,000 in salaries. This would cover 6 legal staff, 3 admin officers and an executive, and also factoring in office costs to that, they would be looking at an expenditure of just over £1 million. Looking at the legal aid expenditure, those defendants that their legal fees are covered under a full criminal legal aid certificate, and also covering the schemes of the court of duty advocate and police station, the total expenditure is 1.6 million. Now, the report states that it's not necessarily, and I would state that the report is actually unclear. It states that the public defence unit is going to be covered just the summary courts, but then in other parts of the report it starts saying it's going to cover possibly police station, general jail, but part of those figures is the expense for representing clients within the higher courts.
And can I just stop there for a moment for those who are listening? Let's just deal with the levels, summary jurisdiction. Explain that for us.
Well, the summary jurisdiction will include the magistrates, the deputy high bailiffs court. That's where all cases start off in the lower courts. If it's decided that the court's sentencing powers aren't sufficient, then those matters will then go up to what we call the Court of General Jail delivery. But often the advice given to defendants covered under the legal aid scheme will start off in the police station, and the police station is covered by an advocate being on a rota 24 hours a day.
And how many of those are on? Is there a number that's available?
Yes, there is. There's around 22 advocates on that rota, and over a 6-month period we will separate that out, and so we will do set weeks. You'll have an advocate doing the daytime hours, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m, and then you'll have another advocate then coming on the evening to make sure that there's always 24-hour cover.
Right, and this is a coverage that is actually paid for under legal aid scheme.
It is, yes. They have a right to free and independent legal advice if it is intended whilst they're at the police station to be interviewed by the police.
So what happens if it then goes to the high bailiff's court or wherever it is, then it's decided that either he hasn't got the sentencing powers or the issue is too important to be dealt in that court, and it goes off into general jail, the high court.
Yes.
Does the legal aid system see it all the way through?
Yes, it does. It does, and often the system that you have at the moment is that the advocates will be representing the client at the police station. They will then represent that client at the summary courts and then carry on up if the matter then has to go up to the Court of General Jail. If looking at this public defence unit, they're only going to be covering the summary courts, what you will have is an advocate representing a client at the police station, then hand that file over to a public defence unit advocate, and then the public defence unit advocate then having to try pass the file back again to the advocate to represent them in the Court of General Jail. So you're going to have 3 advocates reading the same material with extensive costs.
Wasn't this once considered to be the benefit of the Manx system, where you didn't have lawyers and you didn't have barristers and you didn't have QCs, and there was this trouble with transmission of information? I mean, that fact that one advocate did the lot used to be seen as a strength.
And that's the nice thing about advocates on the Isle of Man, that you do have that consistency. You have somebody right from the beginning, you have an advocate right from the beginning, right through representing you, gets to know you, who's giving you the best possible advice, investigating, look at. There's a lot of work that a defence advocate actually has to undertake in order to provide sufficient representation. Working, involving, looking at disclosure issues, investigating, getting expert reports, mental health reports, and so there is a lot of work that actually goes into that. If you're going to get a barrister coming over from the UK, they're going to have bundles of files that they're going to have to read, and the costs for that are going to have to come from somewhere. I think the Law Society's concerns in respect to this scheme is that initially it was only going to be 10 advocates to cover the whole of the criminal bar. I mean, at the present, the criminal bar is covered by at least some of 25 criminal practising advocates.
We go to this department, this whatever you want to call it, that's due to be set up. They have given the staffing levels of that. I don't remember a figure of 10. It was something like 5 or 6.
Now they've actually reduced the figure down to 6. If you take into account that a number of those advocates are going to be replacing the duty advocate scheme at the courts, and also advising and representing clients at courts for summary hearings, then you have to ask yourself the question, well, who's going to be left in the office actually working on that client's case? You may only have 2 in the office covering all those summary cases.
But the workload must vary.
What's been found looking at other jurisdictions and public defence units is that advocates under public defence scheme tend to be overworked, have cases, and unfortunately corners have been cut, disclosure reduced down. It's not necessarily giving members of the public the service which Mr. Cannan is trying to achieve under this report. Which
means, by the sound of it, that if they get overloaded, and there's always a possibility, there's no sort of clearly defined level of businesses, that they will have to call on outside help anyway.
They will, and that's the issue. I mean, what the Law Society is saying is that the areas of the summary courts, possible Court of General Jail, is not going to be able to be sufficiently represented by 6 advocates. It's going to be clear very early on that either they're going to have to come back into the private sector to get advocates, or they're going to have to go to the UK to get inexpensive barristers.
But this is going to be part of the civil service, which notoriously can be bureaucratic. I mean, how do you think that civil service systems and ethics fit in with the legal system and I suppose a sense of justice?
Well, the SAVE scheme talks about saving costs, and costs should never be the driving force over access to justice. This should simply never be the case. So
we've got what you're saying is that this scheme and what is being proposed for purely economic reasons, without any sense of rule of law or justice in it.
And that is correct. And it's fundamental, just and fair judicial system that there has to be available a competent and independent legal representation. It's a fundamental principle that you have that clear distinction between the prosecutors, the courts, and also the defence advocates.
But all of this is now going to be it wearing different hats, they're all going to come under the one government civil service system, aren't they, with just separate sections of it. Did the Law Society have any comment on that? Did they feel that was a risk or not?
The Law Society considers that it would certainly undermine the principle that justice should not only be done but should be seen to be done. Mm-hmm. And how can that be the case where you've got the situation where somebody's going to be arrested, charged, prosecuted, defended by government civil servants, and then ultimately going to be sentenced by another government employee.
Well, the present duty advocates, when somebody needs the services of one, they're being tied up at the police station and they need some help. How do they go about that? Are they given a list and told to choose one, or do the police just ring the duty advocate at that time?
No, the police will just ring the duty advocate that's on call at that time. If the advocates have, if the defendants have their own advocate, then they do have a right to request that. And that will also fall under the duty advocate scheme if that is the situation. But under this scheme, the defendants aren't going to have a choice as to who it is that's going to represent them at the end of the day.
Some people might actually see this as the state forcing lawyers upon them, and there's always, rightly or wrongly, there's a suspicion there, isn't there?
There is, and looking at other public defence units, looking at England, for instance, that choice was never taken away. That scheme actually ran alongside the current scheme that they did have, and it was noted that originally when that scheme was set up in England there was 12 centres, but that has now been reduced down to 5, given that there was a loss in public confidence as to whether they were able sufficiently to represent them. Looking at the Scottish jurisdiction, again that runs alongside the current legal aid system. They have 1,100 solicitors practising in criminal law. There's only 26 that work in the public defence unit. But the Isle of Man is a very small jurisdiction. The population on the 2016 census was only 83,000. When you start looking, well, is this scheme going to work here? And let's compare it to other schemes, say in the US. I believe I've heard Australia, Hawaii. Australia population 24 million, US 323, Hawaii 1.4. I think care needs to be taken that this is a small island, a small population, and the Law Society would state that this type of scheme is going to be unworkable in this jurisdiction.
Now, funny you should mention Hawaii, but I've got in front of me here the statement of purpose for the Hawaii Public Defender. And it says the purpose of the Office of the Public Defender is to safeguard individual rights in all criminal and related matters, from arrest or threat of confinement through all stages of the criminal proceedings, including appeal and parole board matters, if any, consistent with applicable laws, court rules and rules of professional responsibility. Pursuant to this objective, the primary function of the Office of Public Defender is to provide the assistance of effective counsel in all criminal and related proceedings. Now, did I hear you say shortly that this is going to stop before it gets to the High Court, before it gets to General Jail?
Yes, that's right. They're only looking at doing the summary courts.
So what happens then?
Well, then the file's going to have to go back to an advocate in private practice. And if that can't be done, they're going to have to get a barrister that comes in from the UK.
This is on legal aid as well, probably, at this stage.
Yes, it will all be on legal aid, including all the disbursements and fees that are involved in that. But the concern that the Law Society has, that if you start reducing the pool of criminal practising advocates, if this scheme goes ahead and it doesn't work, and the current practising criminal advocates, which I would say practice in this area because they have a vocation to do so, because they choose to, the remuneration that they receive under legal aid is only around a third of the remuneration they could receive in the commercial sector, but they choose to do this. If you reduce that pool of advocates, where is the government going to stand when they suddenly realise actually they're not going to be able to cover this scheme with 6 advocates? And realistically, who is to say there's going to actually be a pool large enough to be able to provide those services? And this is where those additional costs are going to be coming in.
Are you suggesting that perhaps this might mean that a trial is going to be delayed and delayed and delayed because the individual is not going to have proper representation.
Well, it may be possible, and that does happen. Trials are delayed
So
because
the sword
of
of
lack of
Damocles hangs over
representation.
them. That's not a sense of justice either, is it?
No, it isn't. And if you're looking at some of the comments that have come out from the United States in respect to public defenders, where they are reported as being underfunded, overworked, and under constant pressure to extract guilty pleas to save trial costs.
We're talking about plea bargaining now.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this was a note that came out in the report saying, oh, well, this scheme was going to be able to result in advocates working better with the courts, that they would be able to come to pleas in respect because they'd have a better relationship with the courts. But that just shows you how fundamentally flawed that report is, because in fact the discussions will be between the defence advocate and the prosecution based on the weaknesses and strengths of the case, not with the defence advocate and the courts. That just doesn't come into that being.
But when we come to plea bargaining, though, this is effectively, I suppose we should say, somebody accepting a lesser charge on a guilty plea to avoid a trial and possibly a worse situation, yes, even though they may be innocent.
That is quite right, and the reports now coming out of Scotland since they've introduced this public defence unit, in fact the guilty pleas have increased, and they do believe this is because of the overwork of the advocates under the public defence unit, and we see this in America, and there is already concerns in respect to disclosure issues and miscarriages of justice, which we only heard recently on the Panorama documentary in respect to cases running in the UK.
Right. Well, look, it's this time in our conversation we should take a short commercial break. So we'll be back in about 3 minutes. This week's Sunday Opinion, we're discussing the establishment of a public defenders unit, which is one of the proposals contained in the SAVE Progress Report up for consideration at this month's Timble. That's on Tuesday. SAVE is an acronym for Secured Added Value and Efficiencies. Our studio guest is the president of the Isle of Man Law Society, Advocate Jane Gray. Well, Jane, we've got to a number of points, and I think we're going to run out of time on this programme. Would you like to join us on the Man in Line? We can carry on and cover some of the things we haven't got around to.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Well, they say that it's going to save £1 million, but your Law Society seem to think it's likely to cost more than the current scheme. Why do you say that?
We do say it's likely to cost more than the figure which they're saving, which they state as £1 million. They're basing this on the idea that 6 advocates are going to cover a large proportion of the criminal justice system. That's not going to be workable. They're going to have to bring in additional advocates, which are going to create expenses for them. And even looking at the figures over the last 10 years, the Law Society has been able to work out that even based on their own SAVE campaigns expenses, you're looking at making a saving of around £20,000. We do believe that this type of scheme and the resources that they will have to bring in to support the criminal justice system is more likely to treble. And another point also is that the Attorney General's Chambers currently has 29 advocates working within chambers. Another 6 is going to bring us up to 35. That's going to increase pension costs, which Mr Cannan has already noted, looking at their concerns over the public sector
Some of those
pension
advocates
deficit.
are legal draftsmen, aren't they? They were short of those. I think, haven't they recruited some more draftsmen?
It's increasing all the time, the number of advocates in the Attorney General's Chambers, and increasing the costs to the Treasury and also to the pensions.
Now, you said something which I thought was rather strange at the start. You said that you had to go to freedom of information resources, and
That's
you've been
right.
asking for responses and not getting them. But you're the main organisation for law in the Isle of Man. Why have you been ostracised like this?
I don't know why the Law Society has been ostracised in this respect, but we are a key stakeholder in this. We do work within the criminal justice system, obviously, we work within the legal aid system, and we would have been the best organisation, society to have spoken to as to the viability of implementing a public defence scheme. And it has been disappointing that this transparency just hasn't been there in respect to government and the Law Society.
Well, I'm looking at this note which says the board, that's the SAVE programme board, are supportive of this idea and should be progress without further delay to the business case and subsequent implementation stages. And this is what Tynwald's been asked to approve on Tuesday.
And it would seem to suggest that that decision has that foregone conclusion that it is going to be made. And we do have serious concerns as to what the analysis and research that has been done by Treasury to state that this is going to be a viable option that is going to save money. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a resident of the Isle of Man. I was born and brought up here. And this scheme is going to end up creating more costs to government, costs that could actually be used to provide extra services for mental health, addiction services, much needed monies. And it's disheartening to see that this is just going to end up costing more money for the government.
Now, at the end of this conversation, I am obliged to ask you, because you're a lawyer,
Yes.
and it's quite clear that a lot of your lawyers will lose business through this if it takes place. Is how much of your objection is based on all the stuff we're talking about, and how much on self-interest?
If this had been a viable option for government and also for the members of the public, which is part of our role as a law society, is looking at and protecting the interests of the public, we would have been in support of it. But the Law Society considers that this is not going to be a workable
So
scheme.
it's not just an issue of a loss of income then?
No, and what I would say in respect to the loss of income is that, of course, I think initially, yes, there will be a loss of income, but I think we need to put forward that advocates working in criminal will do it because they want to do it, because the remuneration is only a third of what they could get working in some other area of law, but they do it because that's their vocation. They want to work with vulnerable members of society. They feel they are contributing to the community, and that is a choice that they make. And if you take away the work from the private sector and reduce the pool, and then you find yourself in a situation where you're short on advocates, where are you going to be able to go to find that? And that's where the public are seriously going to lose out on.
And all this view, your ideas, your comments, and you've talked about a lot of figures, which I presume they've been evidence, the figures.
Yes.
They have been provided to the various sources, the Treasury and others, have they?
They haven't at this stage, no.
Aren't you leaving it a
Well,
bit late?
we have initially when the Legal Aid Committee had looked at this particular proposal, the Law Society did provide a response in respect to that consultation. The Law Society also asked for the responses from the other organisations that the Legal Aid Committee had asked for their views, and we were also denied that information as well.
Well, maybe we can talk about this a little later, because now we're just a few minutes away from the news, so we must bring Sunday Opinion to a close. Jane, thanks for being our guest on the programme today. Our studio guest has been the President of the Isle of Man Law Society, Advocate Jane Gray, and we've been discussing the implications of the proposal contained in the SAVE Progress Report to replace the Duty Advocate Service and part of the legal aid system with a government-run public defender unit. If you've any views on this Treasury plan, or comment, or questions about the legal system in general perhaps, then share them with us on the Man in Line. That's Manx Radio's phone-in programme that starts at 1:15 after the news, weather and sport. Now, as you just heard, Jane Gray has agreed to stay on to talk to you, and we also have another studio guest in the form of Advocate Terence MacDonald.